Let's talk about unrealistic expectations and the damage they're causing in your relationships.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Edgy Entrepreneur Podcast. We're in season 2, where this season is nothing but relationship development. So we believe that if you want to be an amazing steward to your community, you must master the art of developing relationships, whether they be business or personal or romantic. So this whole season is all about that topic, and today is no different. So we are your hosts. I'm Daniel Tribby. I am a healthcare entrepreneur, and I am a coach for those of you who are also healthcare entrepreneurs.
And my name is Coach Oriana Guevara. I'm a personal performance and executive coach and a certified relationship coach.
Awesome. Let's do it. So I have a question for you, Coach.
Sure.
I'm going to give you a test today.
Uh-oh.
It's something that you've never studied before. It's not a topic that you would know anything about, and I expect you to pass it.
Kind of feels like a setup.
Right. How do you think you would do?
I think I would probably not do well.
And isn't that the same thing we do to people in our immediate circles and communities when we lay expectations on them without actually defining or communicating what those expectations are?
Yeah, actually, that is what happens in the vast majority of relationships.
Exactly. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So if you are giving your coworkers, your significant other, or your friends, or anybody in your immediate social circle a test that they are unprepared to take, you are laying unrealistic expectations on them. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what expectations are, why it is that they come across in this way. It's an internal thing that we believe somebody's going to do or not to do, right? So we're going to talk about what they are, what makes them unrealistic, and then give you guys some antidotes as to how to overcome these unrealistic expectations.
Yes. The outcome of that for you was to say, I knew it. You're supposed to have no expectations in relationships. That is also not correct.
Yes, we will be debunking that myth.
We will be debunking that myth, absolutely.
If you've listened to Gary Vee too much say, the best thing is just to have no expectations and you'll never get disappointed. It doesn't work like that.
Here's the funny thing about no expectations is that it is an expectation that you place on other people.
That's it. My expectation is that you have no expectations.
So an expectation is a strong belief or an anticipation that something is going to turn out a particular way, right? And so in that strong belief, when you're holding a strong belief and you're placing that on someone else's actions and behavior, it actually ends up determining some sort of reality, right? And outcomes. It has an impact on that.
Right, but merely expecting something to happen doesn't exactly mean it's going to happen that way, right? So what you're doing there in this situation is merely creating an implicit social contract, right? So an implied social contract.
By definition, right, it's implying that you know the rules of engagement here, don't you?
You should just know how I feel.
You should know how I feel about this situation too, even if it's different than yours.
We've been doing this together a really long time, and you should know how I like my tea by now.
Well, you know what? You should just do it this way because I said so.
Well, if you would stop emptying the dishwasher from the top first instead of the bottom, like, oh my God. Right? Like,
it's common sense.
And this is all the bullshit that we do to each other because we were taught a certain way. Therefore, everybody else should understand that that's how we do things, and they should know that that's our expectation about how they should do things.
Yeah.
Right?
So just, kind of along the lines of what we were, role playing there, these implicit social contracts, which are often unspoken, are usually based on authority, right? Do it this way, or my expectation is that you do it this way because I said so, by virtue of the role that I play in the context of our relationship,
right?
Or mutual reciprocity.
Right. So if I do something for you, then my expectation is that you should also do it for me.
Correct.
And then and I want to touch a little bit on the authoritarian portion of expectation, because this is present for those of you who are parents, and for those of you who lead teams, right, or own businesses, those types of things. This is an authority-based type of expectation. And the biggest thing with authority expectation is that you have to lay out the foundations for growth, right? I see this a lot in the parenting world, right? Do it because I said so, right? Don't do it. as I do it as I say it, right? Like
Sure, yeah. A lot of employers operate that way too.
Right. Don't do as I do as I say, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what that does is it leaves just this blank space, right? People don't really know what role to follow. And as a parent, right, there is a certain amount of visualization that happens, right? If I see my parent doing something, I'm going to then copy it versus listening, right? Kids just don't have the capacity to hear and remember all the things, right? And as a parent myself, I get on my son all the time. I'm like, dude, how many times have I told you not to leave your backpack there? But if I just keep yelling at him in that sense, setting the expectation that he's not going to leave his backpack there versus me saying, hey, look, this is a safety issue. When you leave your backpack here and somebody's not paying attention, they're going to trip over and bust their ass, right? So you have to lay out the expectation and what it looks like and the reasons for the expectation in an authority base, right?
Right.
So can you define a little bit about the reciprocity, like the mutual reciprocity and how that one exists in expectation world?
There's an exchange and it's mutual in terms of getting one another's needs, wants, and desires met, right? Mm-hmm. But that requires some other types of communication, which we'll talk about as well.
Right.
But it's mutual. That's the whole point, right? And so that gives you an idea, right? When we're talking about expectations and the implicit social contract that's created, there's not a lot of mutuality there. Both people have an implicit social contract, but because it's unspoken, both people's contracts are different, mm-hmm. right? They can't be identical because you haven't talked about it and you haven't agreed on mutual reciprocity, right? In that exchange.
So I've consciously created a deal in my head mm-hmm. that you co-signed on, but you never read the deal.
Right.
Right, is what you're doing when you create an expectation, in particular, for the purposes of this episode, unrealistic ones, right? So when you create this social contract internally and you don't communicate that with the other person, you're essentially holding them accountable to a deal that you never discussed with them.
And that they never agreed to, right? And they're actually doing that in return. They're holding you accountable to a deal and to expectations that you never actually agreed to abide by, right? And so what's the most interesting about that scenario is that when, not if, but when either party violates the implicit social contract, the other person feels like vehemently violated, right? As if there has been an actual breach of contract.
It creates resentment, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then you have this idea of the nocebo effect, right? So where you have this, I've created this contract internally, and I'm holding you accountable to the contract that you know nothing about. Right. And so it is shaping my idea of who you should be or what you should do. And in my mind, you will rise or fall based upon that internal contract I've created for you that you then never signed off on.
Yeah, it's actually what they call a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly.
Right. And so if you hold a person, the theory is that if you hold a person to high expectations, that they will rise to meet them. But if you hold them to low expectations because you don't think that they're capable or worthy of doing or having something, then they won't. Right. And so that's actually been research-based and proven, that self-fulfilling prophecy and that nocebo effect between teachers and children, which is actually very interesting. Right.
Yeah, very much so.
Teachers that had high expectations for the children they were working with actually gave those children certain advantages and were more attentive in their teaching with them.
And so let's jump into this unrealistic expectation realm, right? Mm-hmm. I feel like, people have expectations of each other, right? A lot of times they're unspoken. If you've done them the right way, you've communicated them, which we're obviously going to talk about.
And which most people don't do.
Right. So we're going to touch on these unrealistic expectations, though. Yeah. And some of these are going to really hit home for you. Some of them you're going to have seen on social media. But what we're going to talk about is like 3 primary types of unrealistic expectations, okay? And when we say unrealistic expectations, this is also known as a premeditated resentment.
I mean, the premeditated resentment it's like a subconscious plan or setup, knowing like this person's never going to be able to do this, and then when they fail, I knew it, right? Mm-hmm. And that that circular setup of a person to fail. And when you do that in your relationships, whether that's personal or professional, it feels awful to the other person, because the only thing, the one thing I think that becomes very clear at the end of the fallout is that you knew information that you could have shared with me and chose not to, because you wanted to see how I would behave in lieu of having the information.
Right.
And that's the shitty feeling, right? That's awful.
they don't hold up their end of the non-negotiated bargain, and therefore you were right and you're better and you have high expectations, and this lovely idea of if I'm too much, go find less. All right. So we're going to touch on that. So if some of you have ever said that or heard this go find less if I'm too much, we're going to crush that terrible thought process that you have. So let's talk about these 3 primary types of unrealistic expectations. Okay. So first we have the implicit expectation or implied expectation, and then this idea of magical thinking. And then lastly, we're going to talk on the toxicity-based expectations. Okay. So that's where that example I just gave you a second ago about if I'm too much, go find less. That's a toxic expectation. So we're going to touch on these 3 areas. So let's start with the implicit expectation. So what happens in this implicit expectation?
We talked about this a little bit. This is along the lines of the social contract, right? It's basically a one person constructs a story in their head about how this is supposed to go between us based on the context of the relationship, right? And while they never share that story, they base their expectations very firmly upon, maybe like the behaviors of the other person in real time, never really knowing where the relationship is going or what's unfolding or if you're even going in the same direction, just kind of using cues as clues that you're on the same page when most likely and in most cases you're not on the same page.
And could it also be one of those things where what I imagine to be true about a circumstance should also hold true to you, right? So we were discussing in the planning of this episode this idea that, you acted this way and this way and this way, therefore we must be dating, right?
Right.
So this is an applied or an implied, type of expectation you've put on somebody else, right? So what are some examples of that where we hold something to be true, therefore you must also?
I mean, I think generally speaking, it's anytime that there is in the relationship, one person is implying without certainty and agreement from the other person that you're going in the same direction, right? Where is this going? That conversation that is, people, joke about having this conversation in relationships, but if you're in a relationship and where you have to ask the question, where is this going? That is a very clear sign that relationship started off without clear expectations and without clear communication about what the expectations were or the future vision. The needs, the wants, the desires of the parties involved, right? So, if you find yourself in the place where you're wondering, where is this going? And that could be a romantic partner, that could be a business partner, that could be, a friendship. It doesn't really matter the context of the relationship. If you're asking that question, there has been a lack of communication.
I think too, it happens in the status changes, right? Like, oh, we were dating, you were living at your place, I was living in my place. And then, my friends would come and go as they please. We had a little beer fridge in the corners, my own little bachelor pad, you and your girlfriends would come hang out. And then we take the next step in our relationship and we move in together. And then there's this implied expectation that, the late nights with the buddies randomly stopping by are going to just go away because now you moved in.
Yeah, the expectations based on whatever progression is actually happening in the relationship.
Right.
Certain behaviors will change or stop or start based on us crossing this threshold, right? And then that's never actually discussed, right? And so that's when people end up in situations where it's a marriage where they are in a situation in that marriage that they didn't expect.
Right. And you get this comment like well, we're married now. You can't just go run off and do all the stuff that you used to do. Wait, what? What are you talking about? I can't go to the bar and have a beer with my buddies and watch a football game?
Well, which may or may not be true, but if it was never discussed, when he's walking out the door with his jersey on is not the time to have that conversation.
Right. Exactly. And then this shows up, the status change can also show up in the employment world, right? So if I am, let's say I am moving up the corporate ladder, right? So the name of the show is The Edgy Entrepreneur. So we would assume that all of you at some point are now becoming or looking to become business owners. And one of the things that you're going to deal with potentially is if you're moving your staff up, right? So if you have a staff member that goes from just being a regular team member to in a leadership role, have you clearly defined the expectations of that leadership role? Or did you just put them in the leadership role because they were outstanding in their other role? And then when they don't do things up to where you would expect them to be, and you come down on them, right?
Yeah, that happens the majority of the time in corporate America.
Right.
People get promoted because they're really good at the job they're in, not because they actually have potential to step into leadership, leading people doing that job. Right. And so I guess also the other side of that social contract would be the person who got promoted, expecting that when they got promoted, they were going to get certain types of training or support staff or other things that would support their success in the role. And then they don't, right? It's like, well, you were really good at that. Why can't you be really good at this too? Or just the expectation that whatever you need, you should be asking for. And if you don't ask for it, you're not going to get it. Another one in the corporate world is based on performance, right? If I don't give you performance feedback, just assume you're doing well.
And then when I'm not doing well, you're going to yell at me? I don't understand that.
I've seen that one personally.
Right.
Yeah. And so it's very interesting to think that people are supposed to be able to meet performance targets consistently, be motivated to do that, be encouraged to do it, and have a positive attitude about it. And meanwhile, they're getting zero feedback.
Right.
Right. They're only going to get feedback when numbers go down or when performance is not up to par in some way.
Yeah, but shouldn't you know that though? Shouldn't you be self-governing enough to realize that you have certain things? You're an adult now, Oriana. Like, what? You're an adult.
We shouldn't have to tell you.
Like, oh my God, right? And this is, I keep making light of this and making a joke about it, but it's real. This shit happens. And some of you listening to this have been like, oh yeah, that's me. And it's not healthy. Right? It's the same thing as it made you feel when you were a kid and your parents said, you're 12 years old now. You're not 2. You're 12. Okay, what the fuck does that mean?
What does that mean?
Right? So, because they don't know what the expectations are of a 12-year-old versus a 10-year-old versus an 8.5-year-old.
Yeah, a child cannot tell the difference.
Right, they don't know that. It's the same thing in your corporate area. Like, what is it that you're moving these people into positions of leadership? What are the expectations, and how are you communicating those expectations to these people? Or are you just unrealistically saying, hey, you should be able to figure it out. Go ahead. And if you don't live up to our standards, it's fine. We'll find somebody else who also won't know what the fuck they're doing and put them in your role.
Well, I mean, and that's the magical thinking, right? It's the having an expectation in and of itself should be enough to make it come true.
And this is our second type of unrealistic expectation.
Correct.
Right, is the magical thinking.
Magical thinking.
Right? Keep going.
Right. And so if you're engaging in magical thinking, you're probably thinking to yourself, this is obvious. This is common sense. I shouldn't have to say it. They should already know by now we've been together for X number of years, or they've worked here for X number of months or years. They should know by now, right? And so this is I think the biggest fallout of the magical thinking is that feeling of like being personally affronted when the person doesn't follow through with the expectation that you never actually communicated. You only imposed on them an expectation that because I believe this, it'll happen, right? And then when they don't, again, kind of like the implied contract, it's a personal violation.
You personally offended me because you didn't do the story that I created in my mind that you should be doing.
Right.
And this is the thing, like believing is a great thing. Like as it's applied to your vision board, right? And to your goals, right? I believe I can do it. I believe I'll make it happen. But just like in that scenario, there also has to be action taken for the belief to become a reality. Mm-hmm. Right? It's like people who say, well, I'll just pray about it. If it's meant to be, it'll show up. It doesn't happen like that, right? I'll pray about it and I'll pray for the attributes or the opportunities that come my way in order for me to achieve that goal. The same thing happens in this circumstance. The magic of believing, right, is not going to make the expectation come true unless you then communicate that expectation adequately. Right?
Yeah. In romantic relationships, right? Like just because I imagine to myself that I want a husband to be a certain type of way, right? And then believing that any guy could be that, right? And so people like fall in love and get into these relationships and then realize after they're heavily invested, oh, what do you mean you can't be that? What do you mean you're not this type of woman? What do you mean you're not this type of man? What do you mean you can't do these things, right? Like that magical thinking is actually getting people into really, really toxic, bad situations, right? It's keeping you from reaching your goals, right? Just because I believe this, want it, think it, I should have it. I mean, there's even a sense of entitlement here.
Right.
Look at how much I've done for you. Look at, I've been there for you all along. What do you mean you're not gonna, right? Like that entitlement there and that sense of martyrdom starts to mix in with this magical thinking. And really, at the end of the day, I mean, you're using that way of thinking to justify staying inactive and not making yourself available to communicate your boundaries in order to avoid the potential for rejection, right? If I tell somebody what my expectations are up front, they might not like me. They might decide not to stay in a relationship with me. They might decide they don't want to be my friend anymore, don't want to work for me, don't want to date me, right? And instead of sitting with that and going, you know what, if a person doesn't want X, Y, and Z, or isn't going in the same direction as I am, I'm okay with it, right? Then they're just staying silent. And then later on, confused, surprised. What do you mean? What do you mean we're not going in the same direction? Right. What do you mean you don't want kids? Right? On like fundamental life experiences that change everything.
People desire connection so much over really filtering that connection outside of, he's got to be over 6 feet tall, he's got to be fit, he's got to dress like this, he has to make at least $250,000 a year, right?
Be from a certain type of family background.
Right.
Yeah.
So you have these types of very materialistic expectations, right? And here's the fun part. For those of you out there who desire a man who's over 6 feet tall just so you can feel more comfortable in your heels, or your expectation is you'll feel more comfortable in your heels, actually is a problem because the average height of men in America is 5'10".
I think it's 5'9" even. Yeah.
Right. So you are your 3 inches is causing you to, or your expectation of 3 inches is causing you to miss out on potentially real connection, right? Because your expectation is that people who are over 6 feet tall would fit your mold of who you desire to be with more so than somebody under 6 feet tall who might have better values and moving the same direction as you.
Yikes.
So here's your magical thinking moment.
Yeah.
So what about our third type? Our third type, this one is fun.
Yeah. Toxic expectations. Yeah. You want to talk about that?
No, go. I want you to talk about it.
It's so great.
I do. It's hilarious.
Yeah. I'm expecting people to do things in your best interest instead of their own best interest, or to do things that actually go against their own best interest for your own gratification. That is toxic AF.
And so this is where the whole, if I'm too much or my expectations are too high, then you should go find less situation comes into place. And I hate to tell you this, ladies and gentlemen, you are less. If that's the way you think, you are less. Your expectations are not high, because what you're doing is you're laying barriers to people's connection with you at that point, because you are expecting stuff of them, like Coach said a second ago, that's not in their own best interests.
You're using your unmet expectations and that person's inability to meet your expectation as justification for creating a barrier between yourself and establishing a connection or being vulnerable with someone. And so if you're using these like unrealistically high expectations and going, well, nobody can meet my expectations, and so that's their problem, not mine, you're probably getting a payoff from that, which is as soon as I get to a certain point with somebody, then once it hits my wound, right, let's say my wound associated with vulnerability, being vulnerable and my fear of intimacy, things like that, right? As soon as you touch that spot, now I can use my unrealistically high expectations to push that relationship away and justify exiting and abandoning the relationship and the person in order for me to be able to remain emotionally unavailable and not have to look at my stuff and heal it.
Right. Or even the other side of that is claim that they're not emotionally available enough for you.
Correct.
Right.
Yes.
So there's the other side of that coin, and I think too. I mean, this all ties together is this idea that if somebody's not ready for a relationship, you can make them ready for a relationship, right? They have this toxic expectation that he said he wasn't ready, but I can change his mind. He hasn't met no bitch like me yet, right?
For some people, you're engaging in that behavior, but you're not consciously thinking that. What you're doing is you're holding out an intention that says something like, when they see how fill in the blank I am, they'll open up to it, or they'll change their mind, or they'll want it, right? So like when he sees how loving I am, when he sees how affectionate I am, when he sees what a great wife or woman I could be, he will whatever change his mind from where it is right now.
Or my expectation will be that he will change his mind.
Yeah, and you place that expectation on that person without really asking them, right? So when you do that, you are setting that person up to fail, but even more so, you're setting yourself up to fail, right? For one, you could be using that time, energy, and attention with somebody whose heart and mind and spirit is actually open to receiving it. You know, that would be nice. Some fucking mutual reciprocation.
Right.
The other thing that you could be doing is pouring that time, attention, and energy and love into yourself, which is probably an even better use of your time than giving it away. Because if your mindset is that giving somebody time, energy, and attention would actually get them to love you more and change them, that is so vehemently, fundamentally based in childhood trauma that that's a clear sign that you need to give yourself time and love and attention and pour into yourself.
Essentially, this is along the lines of, you're not the person that you're wanting other people to be. Mm-hmm. Right? So we lay these expectations. Hey, my expectation is that you're not going to cheat, but it's okay for me to.
Right.
Right? Or you are going to work the late hours because you're the leader, but because I'm the leader over you, I don't have to do that. Right? So you have this conflicting battle of expectation because you're supposed to do what I expect of you, but I don't have to hold up the same side of the expectation because I am me, or I am in this position, right? Yeah,
that's when you start to mix in the double standards with the expectations. Truly, truly toxic behaviors start occurring at that point in time, right? Because the rules of engagement only apply to one of the parties in the relationship.
Those are your three angles of expectation, okay? One is implicit. In other words, you're implying expectation without communicating expectation. Two is magical believing. You just believe that stuff is going to happen, and so therefore it will. And then third is your toxic level of expectation, this whole idea of if I'm too much, go find less, or I have high standards, or I have high expectations, that kind of thing. So what if you've communicated your expectations?
Yeah.
Right? What if you have said, this is my feeling, this is my expectation, this is what I like, admire, desire, all of that. What if you've done that? Because I know there's people listening right now, well, I've communicated, or at least I think I've communicated, and I'm still not getting buy-in, or I'm still not getting my needs met.
Yeah.
Right? What's actually happening there?
When you've clearly communicated your expectations on someone, or to someone, and they still have not been able to meet your expectation, it's usually for one of three reasons. It's either competence, willingness, or capacity. So competence means that person needs training, education, information, right? They need to be explained to, this is why I'd like you to do it this way.
How specifically you want me to do it and what it does for you so that I can understand why it's important,
Exactly.
X, Y, Z, right? So this whole, Brendan Burchard talks a lot about the confidence looping, right? So the more I do something or the more education you give me on something, the more confident I will be to deliver it. So the more confidence I have. So that, and this just keeps going. So if it's a competence issue, you can ask them, is it something that like you're not sure how I want it done, or you're not sure what exactly I mean, right? They may just need more information.
Could be something like the employment setting. Mm-hmm. It's very common, right? That something like this would happen, right? Like performance expectations aren't being met. And so you have a conversation about like, hey, what do you need in order to be set up for success? What's missing, right? What's in the gap? The other one is willingness. Right? Willingness means that the person that you've clearly communicated your expectation to isn't meeting the expectation because they're not willing. They don't want to. They don't feel values alignment with your expectation. They don't have a desire to meet that expectation. Your expectation isn't what they want for themselves, right? And so I know it's hard to hear, but this happens a lot in personal relationships, right? One person wants to get married, the other one doesn't. One person sees value in spending money, the other one does not. They see value in saving. Right? One person's expectations for the frequency of intimacy are totally different than the others, right? Like they are not willing. They heard you. That's not aligned for them. They don't want to do the thing, which is why they're not doing it.
So you either come to a synergistic outcome there, or you throw up a couple of these and go on about your business.
Yeah, I mean, for any of these, if you've attempted to get to the place from not meeting expectations, you've tried to figure out whether or not it's a competence, willingness, or a capacity issue, and you've identified what it is, you've tried to close the gap, right? If it's still not working, there's your answer.
Right.
End the relationship.
Done.
The last one is capacity, right? So the person doesn't have the intellectual, emotional capacity to follow through on the expectation. So this could be a child, right? Mm-hmm. You're holding your child up to an expectation that is something beyond their emotional or their intellectual capacity, right? It's for something that you need to adjust or lean into the fact that this person doesn't have the capacity to do it this way right now, right? Maybe they need to learn something, increase their competence, right? Those capacity and competence are related. The other one is, as it relates to capacity, is emotional unavailability or availability, right? Which is the person lacks emotional capacity. They're not emotionally available to meet your expectation. And another one that's hard for people to hear, right? And so, again, if you're thinking, well, when they see this, this, and this about me, they will become emotionally available. They'll just like open their heart. No, they're not. They're not. And the more that you push them to open up, the likelihood is that they're actually going to become more entrenched and closed off toward you because of your pushiness and insistence that they need to be different than who they are and how they are.
Very simply put, the downfall of most relationships, not just personal, but also professional, is not unmet expectations. It's uncommunicated expectations.
Correct.
Okay. So I want you guys to get really clear on that. Like, it's not that they haven't met your expectations. It's that maybe you have unmet expectations because you have unmet the communication standard to set the expectation. So I hope that this episode gives you guys some ideas and some real world things that you can take and apply to your teams, to your families, your communities, that'll really help you open the door for better communication and therefore having your expectations met in a healthy way versus a contract that you've created in your mind that the other person hasn't signed off on, right? So, Coach, thanks so much for all the additions that you add on this expectation podcast. You always bring such good light to a lot of these behaviors that we all experience. So I appreciate you for that. And we will see you guys in a couple weeks for episode 15 in season 2. So thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you guys soon. Take care. Bye-bye.